about how we grow sea vegetable here in Harbor Branch using IMTA system. And topics include preparing plants, systems, and materials. So there is no single set procedure that we need to follow to grow sea vegetables. So if you are interested in growing sea vegetables, my recommendation to you is to think about your design and system using in your environment using our system and method as an example. Let's start with preparing plants. Saliconia is annual plant. So we grow Saliconia from seed. The other species, sea passeling, saltwater sea rice, are perennial plants. So we usually grow these plants from cuttings. To prepare sea asparagus or Saliconia from seedlings, we use styrofoam box like this with gardening slit like this. And it usually comes as a big roll. It's available in a local store. We place a slit to drain water on one side and place this gardening seed on the side where there is a slit. Like this. This is to prevent the sand to drain from this side. Then we place the sand about 2 inches deep. Then we soak the sand with fresh water and sprinkle the seed we usually using this fine mesh to sprinkle the seed on the sand. Then we constantly wet the sand using fresh water and leave this container with a slight slope so that the water drains. The water comes from one side and drains to this side with a slit. Then in 2 to 3 weeks, it depends on the season, like temperature, the plant will be ready to be transplanted. We usually use rock wool cubes, like this. So this rock wool cube usually comes with a slab, different size, and I actually accidentally put this upside down. So this is the downside. It needs to be soaked in water. For Saliconia, we use fresh water. It's recommended to soak in water about 1 hour to stabilize the pH. Then we use Sharpie to make hole. Actually, the other side has some pre-made holes, but we usually like to make a hole like this. And then gently scoop the plants. Oops, where's my slide? So this is the picture about 2 to 3 weeks. Then gently scoop plants and sand from the tray, this box, and separate the plants in the water, and each plant in one rock wool cube. And place it in IMTA system tank, where the IMTA water, the salt water, flows about 1 inch deep. So at this point, the the water is switched from fresh water to salt water. The IMTA water usually meets the salinity mid-30s, around 35, 36, but it depends on the season. In the past 2 years, it ranges quite a bit from high 20s to 40s. Now, the planting cuttings, we need cuttings. We usually plant cuttings from 2 to 3 inches long, but we use about the same length for comparison purposes, but the cutting size can be larger than this. To prepare cuttings, we will need the same rock wool tubes wet in the water. Then, using the Sharpie, we plant the cuttings in a rock wool tube like this. So once all plants are placed in the rock wool tube, we keep this tray. We move this tray in the IMTA system and keep this shaded until it is transplanted in a larger planter. So we have been using salt water, IMTA water to grow cuttings. But in the current study, we noticed that sea parsley and salt water also grows. They actually seems to grow better when you in fresh water when you grow from cuttings. Transplanting the seedlings. So after 30 days or so, it actually depends on by the seasonality. The cuttings will be rooted and it will be ready to be transplanted in the system. So before that, let's briefly mention about the system. So we use 3 different systems to grow sea vegetables. Ebb and flow system, raft, and hydroponic kit. Using ebb and flow system, the water comes from the reservoir and to the sea vegetable tank, and at certain set height, the water is drained and come back to the once it gets drained, once come back to that height. So the water depths fluctuate. To transplant plants in the ebb and flow system, we use plastic mesh to create a planter. So we'll cut the plastic mesh for the desired planter size like this, and we connect 2 sides of the planter using this long 8 inches cable tie. make a cylinder like this. Then we will create a we will create an insert, mesh insert with the drainage sleeve. We cut the drainage sleeve. This is for the insert. Like this. And for desired size, then we tie one end of the sleeve using small size cable tie. Doesn't go through. Like this. And you press this insert within this cylinder. Like this. We call this aquatic planter because water goes through in the planter. Then for ebb and flow system, we will need substrate. We use either sand or clay ball. So this planter has sand in it. So in about 30 days or so, these cuttings will be ready to be transplanted. So these cuttings are more than 3 weeks old. I mean, just 30 days old. But you can see from the above or below that the plants are well rooted. So this is sea parsley. This is sea asparagus, saltwort, and sea bright. We use like PVC pipe, one end closed, and make hole like this. Like this. And then we move this cutting from one rockwood cube in the planter, like this.
You can show it to the camera.
So this is the ebb and flow system planter. So, would you mind to go to? Thank you. Okay. So all plants in general do well in the ebb and flow system with substrate. In particularly, saltwort seems doing well, better than the raft system. But it requires substrate. And this picture, we had 5 tons of sand delivered for 3 tanks of plants. Actually, we didn't use all 5 tons, but it requires quite a large amount of substrate. And so it's quite involving to prepare ebb and flow system using the substrate to grow sea vegetables. And clay balls, it's very pricey compared to the sand. The next system is the floating raft. To set up floating raft, we use Dow blue board, insulation board, which is coated by non-toxic white paint. Like this. So we create a hole so that the small planter can fit in in each hole. This is a planter we use for the raft system, so each planter can fit in the hole. Like this. Then we will also need air stone and later to give plant air bubbles. So the raft plants are soaked in water all the time. That's why we use air stone. And for planting, again, after about 30 days, when the plant established the root, we transplant the plant like this in the system. Like this. So raft system, compared to the ebb and flow system, it's easier to set up, maintain, and also clean. But we observed the growth of saltwater was reduced, and also this saltwater and sea bright colors are much lighter than like yellowish color than compared to the plants growing in the ebb and flow system. The third system is the hydroponic kit. It's called, the method of using this kind of hydroponic kit is called nutrient film technique. This is the first season we use this method, so we are still observing, monitoring how plants grow. But we used commercially available hydroponic kit. There are many different types of kits available, and after considering, looking different system, we selected the one like this ladder style system, so that the height growth of plants is not limited by the layers, and also all the plants get the sunlight, and also it's a good use of the vertical space. With this system, we can plant the larger number of plants per area. Or you can also create your own system by making holes in a PVC pipe, like this. So what we set up is to using 2 units and place side by side so that the 2 units can support each other. So 1 unit you can plant 36 plants per 1 unit. So the entire, the two set of units, you can plant 72 plants. It comes with the smaller planters like this, the smaller size of the basket, and also PVC pipes for plumbing. Now, the harvesting and regrowth. As Megan mentioned earlier, we usually grow sea vegetables for 10 weeks of period so that we can monitor the growth and compare the harvest weight after 10 weeks. But it can be harvested earlier than that. These pictures at harvest in 10 weeks. The sea bright resulted in the largest amount of edible biomass, 1.1 pound, and sea asparagus is the second, 0.6 pound, and saltwater is the next, and the sea passering resulted in the smallest biomass. And one of the studies, we monitor the regrowth, and we confirmed that sea asparagus, sea parsley, and saltwort can regrow after harvest. Sea asparagus can regrow like up to 3 grows, but each time the amount of edible biomass reduces. And for sea bright, we haven't monitored whether it's regrow after harvest. And the plant continues growing after 10 months, and it becomes quite big. If you keep growing, this is a saltwort and sea bright in the background. After 3 months, the plant gets like this big, and the texture and the taste of the plants changes quite a lot when they get large like this. And sea asparagus, sea saltwort, and sea bright develops like woody stem when they grow taller. Is there any questions about yes?
So you mean that it's kind of like you want to harvest them young? You said the texture changes, does it become more firm or more?
Yes. Yes, for the study purposes, we grow plants for 10 weeks, but alternatively, you can plant plants like more high density like this and harvest much earlier than that.
The question was, just to repeat the question, no problem, Ikuko, thank you for your presentation. The question was, when to harvest, and the younger they are, the more edible portion there is. And you can trim and then let it regrow. And as Ikuko said, it gets very woody as they get older, and the plant gets almost bitter. So it is better to harvest in the first 6 to 10 weeks.
True for all the species in general?
In general.
Yes?
Does the discoloration affect the flavor at all?
Does the discoloration affect the flavor?
That's a good question. I'm interested in that question too. But in generally, when the lettuce becomes quite yellowish in the raft tank, and it doesn't look very appetizing.
Just doesn't look at it.
Right.
Yeah. It probably tastes fine. Yeah.
Yes?
So is it any sand, like beach sand, or like, when you dig down, you come to sand?
Yes, that's actually a good question too. So for this demonstration, I'm using the commercially available sand. It's called pre-washed sand. So this probably have like minimum nutrients in it. But at the beginning of the experiment and the current demonstration tank, we use the sand from the dune that is more yellowish, and it's actually plant grows larger than that. So depends on the sand, the amount of the growth will be quite different.
So we do think that there's a difference in the sands that we use. This one is mined in west on Indrio, and it's more of a silicate base. And then we've also used, as Ikuko said, the dune sand, which seems to have maybe more iron in it. So, but once the sand gets established, we believe, going back to the discussion that Pat and Richard were talking about, that there can be establishment of microbes in your sand, so that could also help to improve your sand over time. So the substrate is going to make a little bit of a difference.
Can you buy this sand at Home Depot?
You can buy the sand.
Yes.
Yep.
And the particulate size of the sand, is that?
It's very fine. You'll be able to come up and see it, or see it in the systems that we have.
Yes?
In the hydroponic system, do you place that cutting in some kind of substrate?
Oh, sorry.
In the
So the
hydroponic
hydroponic
system, what is
It's
used?
in the
Okay, go ahead.
planters.
The hydroponic system, ours came with this basket. I think if you use 3 smaller size PVC pipe, you probably can directly put
So that'll support the cutting.
yes.
Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
For regrowth after harvest for the seed life, why does it say unknown? Just because we haven't.
The question was, is why was there a no for the regrowth on the seed blight?
That's because we initially started with 3 species and we started with sea bright last year. So we just haven't done regrowth study. So
it hasn't been done yet, but what we have seen is if you let your plants go to seed, they actually start new plants. So we've often seen that happen with both Salicornia and also seed blight. That just drop their seeds in, and then all of a sudden you've got all these brand new plants that are coming up.
So when you said the plant gets woody after a while, do you just chop it down and start all over?
Do you start all over once the plant gets woody?
so yes and no. So when we have some next study coming, we have to clean the tank. So we have to get rid of the old plants and usually use that plant for like restoration side. But yes, but otherwise we just keep the plants growing. So you will see if you go to the tour, you will see the big plants still growing.
Yes, so it is preferable not to let your plants get to that stage because they're really not going to be suitable for eating. Sometimes we do it just because we've got the space, and you'll see when you go on the tour part with Dennis across the street in that area, we've got some big plants. We've let them go for like a couple years sometimes, and they just get, well, you saw the photo, they just get really out of control, like a little jungle. But it'd be good for restoration, you know, I mean, you don't want to grow them that big for restoration. You want to plant them before that. But that's what happens. You know, you're getting a really nice hardy plant there.
So the other thing is, since most of these seeds aren't commercially available, we have to produce seed for upcoming studies. So we'll let them go to produce seeds for the annuals.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul, is that we are sometimes letting them grow for seeds, which would be something you would want to consider in your own farm. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Keep making seeds.
For the seawater, did you actually get it from the ocean and transport it, or did you procure it at the site to?
The salt water, and that actually comes from the IMTA system. So the water circulates the entire system.
So our seawater comes from wells. We have saltwater wells.
Oh, because.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and we could talk a little bit more about that because you can make your own salt water, like out of the rock salt that you'd use in a water softener as long as it doesn't have the additives in it. And so there are some ways that you can look at also making your own salt water inland. Yes, Dennis?
Quick follow-up on seeds. Do we know how long we can store seeds?
How long we can store seeds for, Richard?
That's something we have not worked on. You know, we definitely find that the Salicornia, the germination rate drops over time. You know, if you have a fresh seed, if you have fresh seeds, your germination rate is really high. The longer you hold those seeds, the germination rate drops quite a bit. And I don't know if it may just be our handling and storage that we're not doing properly. But
So
that's
we haven't done any studies using, you know, the improved USDA methods for germination rates at this point. That's something that we'll probably do going into the future. Because
Yeah.
you know, if you're selling seed, so some of you may want to grow these things to sell seed and become seed producers, you have to meet standards for seed producers, which is generally over 75 or so percent, 75% germination rates that are guaranteed and tested, et cetera, using particular methods. So we haven't applied those methods yet because so much of what we're doing, especially in seed production, is just, you know, so we can do our experiments. But that's certainly something we can start looking into. And then another thing on the seeds that we haven't mentioned also is these. Another thing we haven't mentioned on the seeds is if you're doing large acreage of some of these plants, many of them have very good oil content on the seeds. So Salicornia and the sea blight are very fine vegetable oils. So, but you have to do large acreage to it. And some of them you can produce more oil per acre than many of our oil seed other oilseed crops, like soybeans, et cetera.
Well, yeah.
So when you were germinating, was it the sea asparagus in the sand? Did you guys try doing it straight into the rock wool or no?
So the question is when we germinate the seeds for Salicornia in the sand, have we also tried it directly in rockwool? And Ikuko, if you want to answer that, and also I know that Richard's had a lot of experience with germination.
I haven't done that, but maybe Richard can.
The situation that I found is, we normally deal with individual plants for all of our plantings. We are starting to do some work with densities. We found that, so we wouldn't use up a whole bunch of rock wool cubes. We did them in the sand and then transplanted the plants because we didn't know what our germination rate would be. So even if I stuck one seed in a rock wool, there's a good chance, let's say I had 50% germination, I'd have to use twice as many.
Right.
But they will germinate because we've had plants drop seeds and they just, they'll take off in the rock wool.
Can you do like 3 or 4 seeds in a rock wool?
Yeah, you could. We're dealing with individual plants for our research, but you
Right.
could do 3 or 4 in there, and the plants will probably be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can do multiple, and Ikuko had an example of the small pot with the Salicornia in it.
Yes,
Yeah, that one. So there's a situation where you could have a higher density, and really when they're doing it on large acreage, they're just sowing the seeds, bringing the fresh water in, letting them sprout, and then bringing the salt water in. So there are some great methods out there.
When you harvest that, you just take the whole thing out?
How do we do the harvest is the question.
So that's a good question. So when we harvest, we usually cut from the bottom for green part, bottom of the green part for more like research purposes to measure the above ground biomass and the edible biomass. But if you would like to regrow, probably you want to see some green portion, at least like one node in the bottom, so that the plants regrow from there.
So it's like cut and come again?
Yes.
And how many times can that be done?
Nicola?
So she had a follow-up.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Follow-up question was
Oh, how many times can you cut? That's a great question, the regrowth. Yes.
I observed second regrowth, the first regrowth after the harvest and the second regrowth after the harvest. But at the second regrowth, the plant was very small.
Yeah.
We did an experiment, Richard will tell you right now.
Yeah. We did a study, which we haven't written up. Salicornia is very similar to lettuce. If you plant it during the warmer months, like if you were to plant it now, it molds, so it'll start to produce seeds. So what we find is we get the best vegetative growth for edible portion if you plant them in the late fall, I guess, early winter. And then the study we did, we harvested them 3 times. We got vegetative growth for edible portion, and then we let the plants let them go to flowering and seed after that. So we got 3 crops off of it.
The plant does get very bitter when it goes to flower. So once you start seeing the flowers, your vegetative growth for food is pretty much done. It gets very bitter after that.
Yeah, it gets bitter the more you have regrowth. So typically a 2 or 3 times, or excuse me, not so much regrowth, but when they go to seed, when it starts showing that seed, the tips of them.
Even the flower.
Even the
Once
flower. Yeah.
The flower looks like a little cone that develops. They look like Christmas trees, and once you start getting the cones, then the flowers. Then
Yeah.
They get bitter.
So we can take 2 more questions and then we'll move on, but we'll have, Nicola, you can have your hand up.
For all of the species you're talking about, would you say about 2 to 3 times you can cut it for harvest?
So the question is can you have 2 to 3 harvests for all the species?
That's a
Ikuko.
good question. For Salicornia, saltwort and parsley, we observed 2 regrowth. So after harvest, to regrowth.
We actually harvest purslane repeatedly for
Yes,
long periods of
I
time.
think so that if you leave the parsley, it keeps growing.
It does keep growing.
Yeah, I think, as Kevin said, the purslane will just keep growing, and I think that is one of the crops that you can have multiple, and that it's really the betas because it starts to go woody, and even the salicornia starts to go woody, and the sea blight, we've also seen that it can get a really tough thing, but you just don't get that with sea purslane. So that's a good point. That one is really a continuous culture. And that's probably good because we can't find seeds for that. I'm sure they make them, but who hasn't asked a question that is, okay.
So I did not hear for, like, say, the seed blight. You start that from seeds, right?
Yes.
And would you recommend sand as the starting substrate or the?
Actually, sea blight for this season, we started with cuttings. So this was from cutting.
Okay.
So we have done the sea blight with seeds. Richard did this. It took what? It took almost 2 months to get small plants to germinate. Is that right, Richard?
You know, germination on the seed light was very, very, very
Slow.
Very slow.
Did you do it in sand or rock wool?
Rock wool,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's switch gears. As we're switching gears, we could actually entertain some more questions as we're going to bring up the we're going to switch from the demonstration here to the culinary. Ikuko, thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it.